This is Free to Exchange, the show where free markets and free-thinking scholars meet. I'm your host, Ben Powell. Today we're going to discuss housing markets around the United States. We'll start by discussing past and present government programs intended to help poorer Americans afford housing. Then, on the second half of the show, we'll discuss housing costs and other factors shaping interstate migration along the coast and Middle America. What role has government policy played? What market forces are shaping migration? What does this mean for our economy's future? We'll talk about all of that and more on today's show. My first guest is Dr. Amanda Ross. Dr. Ross is an associate professor of economics at the University of Alabama, who, among other topics, conducts research on housing and urban economics. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Ben.
So, we're in a little bit of a fortunate place being here in Lubbock talking about this, where housing costs are relatively affordable. But across a lot of the country, particularly the coast, housing costs are really high, making it difficult for poorer people, and particularly young poorer people. And often there's calls to just do something about this. And the government, going back decades, has been doing something about it. Now, if we go back to 50s, 60s, 70s, their usual answer was, well, if housing's unaffordable, we're going to have the government make it, and we'll just let poor people come live in it. So public housing, can you tell us a little bit about the history of that and how it worked?
So part of the initial motivation behind public housing was that the units that these poor individuals were living in were so bad. They were rat infested. And
the tenement type.
The tenement type, like all of those types of things were just, it was disgusting and basically unlivable. So the idea behind it was, well, the government's going to get involved and they're going to build these units and the government's going to operate them. This is going to make it better. This is going to give them a better housing, a better place to live in terms of the quality and all of that.
Yeah, and these, I mean, if you're in New York City, you see the housing projects sticking up, but this was across the country, all these places. It didn't quite work out so rosy. What were some of the problems that were encountered?
So there's a couple of problems. So first of all, as many of us know, public housing is associated with concentrations of poverty. And with concentrated poverty, issues can come up. There could be gang violence, there could be poor educational outcomes, there could be crime, all these other types of problems, drug use, whatever else. But even if we assume that all of that is untrue, assume that that isn't a problem, these are really expensive units for the government to run, for anybody to run, because if you think about it in general, if someone owns their house versus if they rent their house, when you rent your house, you don't take as good of care of it. It's when it's your own personal home, you're really invested. You want to maintain it, upkeep it, everything else. So now we basically have a bunch of rental units. The government's the landlord. It's an absentee landlord. They're not there. They're not in town usually checking up on these things. So the deterioration and the costs were just extremely high.
Yeah, they don't have quite the same incentives as a private landlord. This is a little bit different, but I spent some time in Cuba recently and stayed in the government-owned hotels.
What was that like?
They suck. They were run down and awful. And but side by side, you had private people renting out apartments they had the incentive to, even though as a renter I didn't really care, they stayed on top of it because they wanted to keep making a profit, whereas the government hotel didn't.
Right. Yeah.
It's a similar thing in public housing here.
Right. It's likely a similar type of problem where, again, you take out that incentive to maintain. And
so as policies has evolved, I think most economists have been critical of government public housing, and the bureaucrats have eventually kind of realized this too. There's been a move away from it overall. This next solution that they come up with from this is vouchers, and that's something that you've studied in your research. And I guess the closest similarity that most people would be familiar with that's talked about more is, school vouchers, right?
Right. So if we think about this in terms of these public schools and how we're going to provide schooling for public education, initially, we had just the physical structures, and where you lived is where you went. And that's the equivalent of this public housing type of thing. It was the supply side, government's investing in this, government is providing this service. But then there was more of a recent switch to school vouchers, where you have a school voucher, you can use that voucher anywhere where there's an opening. So it's not necessarily your neighborhood one, but there's an opening in the much better school district, a couple towns over. I'm willing to drive there, I'm willing to go there, and the government's paying this difference. Housing vouchers are a similar type of situation. They're a similar type of motivation where instead of the government's going to run, operate, and provide these units, maintain them, which is its own set of issues, here, take a voucher, find a landlord that's willing to rent you at that price, and then that individual, and then the private market's going to take care of this in the sense of the government will pay the landlord, And then through this, the landlord will upkeep it, and we won't have this concentrated poverty. It won't be this huge cost to the government anymore.
Right. So they won't all be centralized in the same place.
Right.
We won't do government provision. Instead, we're going to do third-party payer, essentially. So how does the third-party payer work? So does everybody get one of these vouchers who's poor? How does it work?
So a few things about housing vouchers that are very different from a lot of the other government programs we're used to. So like food stamps. If you are below a certain income level, you qualify. Same with TANF and a lot of these other welfare programs. Housing vouchers are not an entitlement program. They're allocated through wait lists. So for example, in most large cities, the wait list is actually closed. So you can't even sign up to get one because it's over a 2-year wait. It's over a 2-year wait at this point, and they can't accommodate everybody in a reasonable time. So it's really, really difficult to even get on the list in order to get one of these vouchers to help out. Once you have a voucher, so you come off the list, you have approximately 60 to 90 days, depending, to find an acceptable unit. And then once you find that acceptable unit, you contribute 30% of your income, and then the government pays the difference. So if we think about this, so for example, in Lubbock, it's based off of the fair market rent. So the fair market rent in Lubbock for a 2-bedroom apartment is about $850. So
according to the government estimate.
According to the government estimate. So if you think about what would an $850 apartment look like in Lubbock, what would it look like? I'm not from here.
A decent 2-bedroom place, it would be perfectly acceptable. It would be a decent apartment here, yeah.
Right. So
most of our grad students probably live in apartments that cost less than that.
Yeah, so that says a lot about this. So $850, you could get a pretty nice place. And so if at that moment you're unemployed, the government will actually pay your entire rent. If you have a job, you contribute 30% of your income, and the government just pays that difference.
So easy. If you earned $1,000 a month, you pay $300. The government picks up $550.
Yep.
This seems like an improvement over public housing, but I got some skeptical questions here.
Okay.
So one is, if it's not an entitlement, only some poor people get it and other poor people don't, we're stimulating if we think economics here, right? People, supply and demand. This is giving cash to demanders who otherwise are cash strapped and can't afford things. Isn't this going to increase demand and push up price so people who get the vouchers win, but other poor people get crowded out?
So that actually ties into some of my research and some of the stuff I've looked at. So what is actually true and what is interesting is if you're thinking about the poor, the low income, what actually happens is we've taken these people out of that market. So again, we're thinking about supply and demand. We've taken the demand of some of the people that used to rent those units out, and we've moved them up into this middle income, this middle tier. So in my research, what we actually find is that for those units that are at the bottom, prices are actually decreasing. But for those units that are more at the middle, near this fair market rent, so around this $850 cutoff in Lubbock, you're actually seeing prices there start to increase a little bit more for those types of units. And then if we're talking over, so the units that's like $1,000 for a 2-bedroom, they're just not affected. They're not even dealing with any of this. They have nothing to do with it.
Right. So in concrete terms, it's taking people out of, say, the $500 a month apartments in Lubbock and pushing them up to $800, which makes the 500s more affordable for really poor. It's that maybe lower middle income group that now they compete with and push housing costs on them?
Right. So that's where we're sort of seeing the supply and demand. There are different segments of the market. And so in one segment, it's pushing prices down because we're moving down demand, but then we're moving up demand in another segment and pushing the prices up there.
All right. Another problem, Paul. So you convinced me on that one. It's still going to screw some people over, the working poor there, but it at least doesn't crowd out the other very poor. Next one, though. The key here, you said you contribute 30% of your income, and you said if you earn nothing, the government would just give you $850. This seems to have perverse incentives. Do some people just say, oh, well, now my housing's taken care of. I guess I don't have to work as much?
So that is a concern, and that could be a problem. That's not something my research speaks directly to. But in some of the research out there, what is true is that the average voucher recipient only is using a voucher for 3 to 4 years. So you can use a voucher forever, in theory. What is true is that most people do not. They do tend to use this as a tool to help them get back on their feet and get going again, free up some of that income, but there are exceptions to everything.
Okay, so also related to it, one of the problems with public housing was like the density of concentrating the poverty. You said they only have, would you say, 60 days to use this?
They have 60 to 90 days to use the voucher once they're allocated.
So how much does this actually disperse people?
So what's true is that there's variation over time. So what Also, something that we've looked at in my research that we have found is that initially these people don't move very far. They get this voucher, you have 60 to 90 days to use it. It's a huge benefit to them. It's a good chunk of money for them in terms of helping with their income and everything and afford housing. So they just find something nearby that works, lease up there so they can secure this voucher. And then a couple years later, we see them moving to slightly better neighborhoods. So there's that initial, I want to secure this, I want to make sure I get to keep this, and then I'm going to find something better. Possibly closer to work, possibly closer to jobs to solve some of those issues in terms of transportation to work. But
now, another weird perversity here, right? It's a federal program. You said lots of wait lists are closed, some are open. Do people get it in one market and then just go somewhere else entirely?
So housing vouchers are portable. So if you do move, you can go to another, you can take your housing voucher with you to another area. So there were some cases. So for example, when I was in grad school, Atlanta opened up their housing voucher list. And there were people that came from DC to try to get on the list because DC's list was closed. So that does happen. That can come up because, like you said, it is a federal program and it can be used anywhere.
So this has all been about addressing the demand side, that people's incomes are insufficient to get them the right type of housing. But there's a supply side of this market too, right? So what is fundamentally the problem of why housing is unaffordable for many people? Is it because their incomes are too low, or is it something on the supply side of the market?
So, and that's something that there are a lot of factors that are coming into this. So how big of a housing affordability issue is it here in Lubbock, Texas, do you think?
Not particularly, and I've got an idea why.
Okay, what's your idea of why?
I'm supposed to be interviewing you. But I think supply is the big thing here. And, in Lubbock, builders are basically free to build, if you will, whereas I lived in California and Boston before, and it's hard to get permission to build there.
Well, so there's two parts of that. So first of all, there could be the regulation side of it. And what is true is Texas tends to be less regulated than a lot of other markets. But what's also true about Texas, this is my first time in Lubbock, and what is true is you can just sort of see forever. It's the very flat, easy to build on type of environments. So what I mean is if you think Vegas too. Vegas is very flat. Phoenix, we've got some flatness as well. You can just build out forever. You think about Manhattan, where there's a huge housing affordability issue. It's an island. You cannot build out anymore. The only thing you can do is build up. And also what's true about building up, it actually costs more because the supplies are going to have to be sturdier to hold all the weight and everything like that. Yeah. So there is the mixture. Even if we assume away regulations, what's going to be true of some of these markets, there's going to be a supply constraint that's going to make it so we can't necessarily build out as much as we would want.
All right. We're going to talk more about these supply constraints in the next half of the show. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
My next guest thinks our country's economic future is in the heartland, not the coast. Housing costs are a factor, but they're not the whole story. Stick around and hear the rest of the story.
This program is made possible in part by a grant from the Helen Jones Foundation, supporting education and the fine arts in keeping with the philosophy of Helen DeWitt Jones, who devoted her later life to sharing her wealth as a patron of philanthropic causes. The Helen Jones Foundation. Free to Exchange is a joint project of Texas Tech's Free Market Institute and Texas Tech Public Media. More information is available at fmi.ttu.edu.
Welcome back. Joining me now is Joel Kotkin. Mr. Kotkin's the Presidential Fellow in Urban Futures at Chapman University in California and the Executive Director of the Houston-based Center for Opportunity Urbanism. He's also the author of The Human City, Urbanism for the Rest of Us. Joel, welcome to the show.
Nice to be here.
So, as we sit here in West Texas, I know you've said things that you think the heartland of America is where the future of our economy is. Why?
Well, it's the future of our economy if we want to have a good future, in the sense of what's clearly happening is the coastal economies are now so heavily regulated, so heavily taxed, and so expensive that upward mobility is being shut off. When I talk to 35 students in my class, I say, how many are you going to stay in Orange County? Which, by the way, is about as nice a place as exists. 3 or 4 say they're going to go. They're all talking about Dallas. They're talking about Nashville. What we're seeing, and the numbers will show this, is millennials are beginning to move into particularly heartland cities, and very often cities, at least in the sort of Charlotte range, that kind of 1 to 3 million.
So you're not talking, the last more than 100 years has been people leaving rural and going to urban.
Right.
You're not talking about a reversing of that trend. It's something a little different. It's about where urban is.
Well, I think you have to look at it as potentially a continuum where you start off with people moving out of the large megacities and which is clearly happening, to smaller cities and moving from the coast more towards the either the south or the middle of the country. I mean, places like Kansas City and Columbus now have better net migration of millennials than New York or Los Angeles or Chicago. The question is, where does this go further? If we begin to move further, we may see certain little nodes, at least, of smaller cities that also attract millennials and industry at the same time. I think it's a gradual process. We're actually in the midst of identifying where they are going in the heartland. My assumption is they're going to be places with good economies. University towns are probably going to do reasonably well. Sometimes there are amenity regions, places that are very attractive. But fundamentally, this process is going on. I think we really have reached almost peak megacity, if you want to put it that way, in the United States. I just think LA is losing population. I mean, the big city with the best weather in the world. If that's happening there, it's happening in other places too.
So let's take a look at this in terms of what's going on with the urban planning in cities. Then it's kind of what you've talked about in the human city versus kind of the urban planner's city. How is this manifesting itself on the coast maybe different than some of the interior cities?
Well, one of the things we're seeing, for instance, in places like California, and there are a few other places, but California's sort of extreme, Oregon's pretty good for it too, is that what you have really people think single-family homes are bad. Some say single-family homes are racist. I don't know why, because half of all minorities live in them. But single-family homes are bad. They're bad for the environment. And so we should force everybody to live in an apartment. The problem is you have a millennial generation now hitting their 30s, probably getting a little bit of later start, and they want a single-family home. They grew up in one. When they start to get married and have kids, that's what they want. And the same thing with immigrants. Immigrants come to America. They don't come to America so they can live in a one-bedroom apartment. Their dream is to live like Americans.
Like an American dream.
Right, exactly. So, I remember when the planner said, well, people from Asia, they're not, they're used to living in high density, so, they won't mind it. And I said, if they liked high density, they would have stayed home.
So what are the things that the urban planners or the government policymakers in these cities are doing to try to enforce their vision of what the city should look like?
Well, one of the things is banning single-family zoning, not allowing new subdivisions to be built. And now we're seeing something even more really pernicious, which is this attempt to actually go into single-family neighborhoods that have always been single-family neighborhoods and have been zoned for that, and saying, you know what, you bought this house, you had this assumption, that's gone. We're going to build a 6-story apartment building next to you, and too bad. And I think what we're doing is we're gradually destroying our last great urban neighborhoods, and family-friendly urban neighborhoods, and they're being gradually destroyed by sort of what we call enforced density.
Yeah, I'm not a favor of enforced density, but I don't mind seeing a city grow up bigger and replace single-family homes if they're allowed to build more single-family homes. But
exactly.
I remember when I lived in San Jose, they had an urban growth boundary around the city and just said, can't build past here. What does that do to what kind of a natural evolution would be?
Well, what happens is where you would have had single-family homes, which, by the way, would have dropped land prices in the city as well. What you get is you get people are very concentrated in these areas that are becoming incredibly expensive. Somebody buys a little craftsman house in San Jose that's not a great house, 2,000 square feet, and now it's $2 million. Well, that's not exactly something that's going to work for most families. So I think what you see is you restrict where you can build, and then there are all sorts of opportunities to build all sorts of things. We just did a study at the Center for Opportunity Urbanism on gentrification. We found that South Dallas has more open space, not developed, than the size of the island of Manhattan. You go to Chicago, huge parts of the South Side, huge parts of the West Side, almost going back to prairie. There's lots of opportunities to build all sorts of densities, but we don't do it. We see the same thing in Los Angeles, large areas that are essentially empty. And so what we're suggesting is that we should take a look at all different kinds of housing. I don't think you only single family housing, but you have to have a mix. And the problem is when a city decides we're only going to do density and we're not going to build single family homes in our metropolitan area, then young families have no place else to go but somewhere else. And guess what? They move to Charlotte, they buy a house. They move to Dallas, they buy a house. And that's what even my students are saying to me. They're saying, look, in 5 years, 6 years, when you get married, start wanting to have children, I can't stay here. There's no way I'm going to afford a house in Orange County.
In the 6.5 years, we're a small urban area here in Lubbock, but I've seen tremendous development, and it keeps kind of spreading out farther from the city. So that's moderated prices elsewhere. There's still high square footage prices, kind of in a desirable neighborhoods right near the university, but the building on the periphery helps keep the cost in the middle down, but we don't see that in the coastal cities right now because they're not building on the periphery, right?
Well, right. Well, you take a look right now, and sometimes it's tied to energy. Like, for instance, Westchester County, now there's no new gas connections. So you can't even build a house anymore. Period. I mean, eventually what the planners really want is to create a situation where essentially only wealthy people can have single family homes. That's really their goal. And what's really absurd about it is our population is not growing as a country. We're really not growing very rapidly. Our growth rates are low. Our biggest crisis in the next 20, 30 years is going to be a lack of workers and a lack of children.
So related to this, because you've mentioned now the immigrants and the millennials starting to want to have children as kind of, are they a canary in the coal mine? Where is the migration, particularly of those groups, going, and what does that say?
Well, very dramatic shift in the last 5-6 years, but many of them are moving places like Houston, Dallas, Charlotte.
Which are big cities.
They're big cities, but they're suburban cities. They're spread out cities, and they're historically relatively affordable. And they're beginning to look at places like Columbus, and they're beginning to look up. Des Moines is a place that's attracting lots of people now. And so I think you're seeing a process that's evolving where they're beginning to say, I really can't be here. I've got to go somewhere else. And basically, that's the story of the United States. The United States, basically starts in New England, and people say, well, I can't farm, I can't make it in Boston, so I'm going to go to Ohio. Well, this is just another version of that same American saga.
Except instead of going out to the frontier, they're filling in the middle of the frontier.
That's exactly right. I mean, what we had in America in the last 50 years was a concentration, particularly after the Rust Belt occurred and the destruction of the industrial base. People fled the old cities of the Midwest, and they moved very heavily to California, some to Texas, but really California was pretty strong tendency. And people had to leave the countryside in smaller cities. If you live in upstate New York City, you got to leave. You got to go someplace else. I was in Charlotte yesterday, and it was really funny because they said the biggest group that they were coming in were from Buffalo. I mean, Buffalo is simply losing all its population, and and a lot of them are going to Charlotte.
So I want to take advantage of this since you are in a unique position, running one group in California and another group in Houston, for our last couple minutes here to compare what's going on in the migration of California to Texas, policies driving it, some comparisons.
Well, historically, Texans were one of the big groups that came to California. Our former speaker, Willie Brown, was from Texas. Our former mayor of Los Angeles, Tom Bradley, was from Texas. Tex Thornton, one of our great industrialists, obviously was from Texas. And that has started to reverse really within the last 5-10 years. And a lot of it is people can't afford to live there. And lots of businesses, if you're not a kind of super high-tech type of business, if you need energy, if you need land, if you are worried about the cost of electricity, you got to go to some place like Texas. So you also, if you have middle managers, you need middle managers, you can't stay in California. So you get Toyota moving to Dallas.
So that's interesting because a lot of people will kind of talk about Austin and technology companies in Austin comparing to Silicon. Of course, some people say Austin's not Texas too. That comparison, but you think the bigger drivers, not the high tech stuff, but the kind of meat and potatoes industry.
Well, I think it's both. But what's interesting about tech it too is moving heavily to Texas. And Austin is certainly there. And it's interesting. Where is Apple expanding? Williamson County, which is not downtown Austin. Most of the tech in Austin is to the north, around the Domain and the more suburban areas. So tech is part of it. But increasingly the differential between tech and, let's say, Toyota is not what it once was. Toyota uses a lot of tech people. It's really a question of, if you're on the coast, you either have very high-end employees or you get people in their 20s, you burn them out and they leave. If you need a manager for 20 years or 10 years, somebody working for an engineering company, you can't do it in California, because that 25-year-old, 35-year-old person who wants a stable life just can't afford it in California.
And they can get it here in Texas.
And that's exactly right.
Thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it. We're fortunate here in Lubbock that housing affordability isn't really the issue the same way it is in other parts of the country. In our first guest, we talked about various government attempts to deal with this that have really tried to work on the demand side of the market, whether direct government provision of housing, and then the problems with that maybe vouchers were a better idea, but it's still the demand side of the market. Ultimately, in my opinion, I think the major problem for housing affordability in America is not about intrinsically scarce land. It's rather government permission to build. This is particularly true in California and the northeast of the country, where housing prices are the least affordable. Our second guest talked a little bit about this and how it's influencing interstate migration. And I think the good news for us listening to this in West Texas is the future seems bright for a place like Lubbock based on these factors. We'll see you next time.